Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Body Wisdom Podcast. Today, we have a very special guest, Tim Soar, who's going to be joining us all the way from Wales. And Tim grew up in London, actually, but he's been living in Wales for many years. And he began his career as a musical instrument maker. And his interests as a musician and as an Aikido practitioner led him to the Alexander technique. He qualified as a STAT teaching member in 1993, and since 1995, Tim has taught Alexander Technique at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama, the National Conservatoire of Wales. In addition to his home practice, Tim maintains visiting teaching practices in London and Aalborg, Denmark. A recent development is a collaborative project to offer residential courses focusing on yoga and Alexander Technique. Hi, Tim, and welcome to our show. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you, and thank you very much for having me.
Oh, we're so happy to have you. You have written a wonderful, brilliant essay that I absolutely love, and the title of your essay is Creative Attention, Thoughts on Learning and Teaching, and on a Social Dimension to the Alexander Technique. Could you tell us a little bit about what inspired this piece of writing?
Yeah, I think initially when people see an Alexander teacher working hands-on, there's some kind of assumption that it's a little bit like massage, or that there's some kind of manipulative therapy going on, or there's some kind of correction going on, adjustments towards kind of correcting what the student is doing. And I guess some of my students experienced that wasn't really what I was doing, but they couldn't really work out what it was that I was doing. So quite a lot of people over a short space of time, and it's one of these things where you get a lot of coincidences, quite a lot of people over a short space of time were saying, so what is it that you're doing? Yes. And I guess that was what led me to try to write it down.
Yes. No, it's brilliant, because I think that this is a question that many of us teachers get asked over and over again, is what is it? What is this Alexander Technique thing, this enigma that you can't quite place in words and explain? But I thought you did a wonderful job in this piece. And this essay, it seemed kind of like a song and a dance to me, in the way that the words informed the movement of the piece. And I got this sense of duality from the piece throughout the essay, which kind of underscored this fluidity of roles in teaching relationships. Like you mentioned, the dynamic in our work as Alexander Technique teachers as a sort of collaboration, one that you actually called a duet, which I particularly liked. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Sure. I think Alexander was very astute in realizing that what goes wrong with the way we move is often not so much a physical thing, but it's more a kind of reactive problem. And that particularly applies to reactions that are to do with fear. Mm-hmm. So if you take a really simple everyday situation where somebody says, oh, that situation makes me tense, then often that's literally true, that they're actually talking about muscular overcontraction and how unpleasant or distressing or disabling or painful that is. But the solution is not so much to say, oh, I've got to learn to relax my muscles, but rather to look at how we're reacting and to make the changes there. And it dawned on me that whilst in Alexander work, particularly in group workshops, we'll often use something like catching a ball as a stimulus, or with a musician you might say, well, let's just get your violin out of the case and we'll just see, what if there's something that you're getting ready in some unhelpful way. And of course, all that's valuable, but it started to dawn on me that the most important reactions and the strongest reactions and the strongest stimuli in people's lives are to do with other people. And often specific people in specific situations. So then if the Alexander technique is a kind of study of that situation, of sort of problematic stimulus and intelligent response, and if our most powerful stimuli and reactions are associated with other people, then I started to say, well, hey, the Alexander technique is actually about how we are with other people. And then I went one step further than that, and I said, well, maybe what happens in an Alexander lesson could be understood as a kind of microcosm of that. So, and then there's one more bit, if that's okay.
Of course.
And then because I'm a musician and I work with Alexander technique with musicians a lot, I started to notice the relationship between really, really good coaches and accompanists and how they didn't so much instruct their students as make music with them. And I started to think, actually, that's the thing that is most educationally powerful. And so that's the model that I now try to live up to in my Alexander teaching. I try and make kind of Alexander music with people rather than bossing them about.
It's wonderful. It's also, I think, a new way of thinking, and as far as our role as teachers, and it changes that dynamic of, teacher, student, and it kind of brings us all closer, this kind of equalizer, which I really like. I'm going to read an excerpt from your piece.
Can I
Yes, of course.
say one thing about, well, it's just to say that, I mean, particularly in my London practice, I find myself working with people who might be directing operas at Covent Garden, and there's kind of, these are high-powered people, right? And there's no question of me saying, well, I'm the expert here. Yes. It's got when you're working with people of that sort of expertise, right, it's really got to be, I think, a collaborative process or a patronizing one. So I think it's got to be the first.
Right. Absolutely. I agree with you. Sometimes you don't know the people that walk in through the door, who they are.
Yeah, sure.
And we just all become human in that moment, human to human, which is lovely. There were so many parts of your essay that I loved, and this particular one stood out to me. I'm going to read it. And you wrote, "There is an ever-present risk that we may misperceive that which is right in front of us, which needs to be countered through the rejection of what we feel we know, but in fact do not, and through the practice of proper observation which questions and corrects our preconceptions. So with my hands on a student, what I sense going on in her is a challenge to my tactile and kinesthetic preconceptions in the same way as the model in a life drawing class is a challenge to what I believe I see. I do not touch or otherwise observe a student primarily in order to judge or to analyze, but in order to correct myself and my own misunderstanding." And Tim, for the people who are listening to our show who don't know what faulty sensory appreciation in Alexander's work is, to me that is essentially what you're addressing in what I just read, this notion of misperceiving what is right in front of us and relying on what we feel as opposed to what actually might be, for a lack of other word, reality or just what might be as opposed to what we feel. So I wanted to ask you to sort of elaborate more on that particular part, because I think that's a big part of our work in the Alexander technique teaching?
Sure. You picked up a little bit from the essay about something that I said about life drawing, and that might be a good point just to fill in what that
Yes.
example's about, because I think
Yes.
it does illustrate it. If anybody who's been to a life drawing class knows that the main problem is that one has ideas about what a leg is like, or a shoulder is like, or how big a hand is compared to a head, and this kind of thing. And most of those preconceptions are simply not true. And what one finds oneself drawing the first time you go to a life drawing class is something really weird, because one isn't really looking. One is drawing what one believes one knows but doesn't. So I think that's quite a good example of faulty sensory appreciation. There are various aspects of faulty sensory appreciation, but we're talking the one that's to do with just not bothering to look, which I think is quite a fundamental one. And gradually, if you get more experienced at life drawing, then you start really looking and being able to understand that one doesn't know. And I think that's really important. And I think the idea of the kind of expert who comes in and fixes things is an important myth to bust.
Absolutely.
Because of course, in one way, I kind of hope I'm an expert. But in a more important way, what Alexander's describing is not, with faulty sensory appreciation, is not something that the pupil has but the teacher doesn't. He's describing something that's to do with kind of the human condition, and that 3 years of teacher training doesn't cure faulty sensory appreciation.
Yes.
Alas. So I think if one is going to be kind of thorough about what one is doing as a teacher, it's good if you can find a way to take that faulty sensory appreciation, my faulty sensory appreciation, into the lesson in a way that's actually useful. So I had this idea of, well, what if I treated the student like a life drawing model, and my job was to look properly and look with my hands, as well as my eyes. And the remarkable thing is that once I started working with people simply with that question, that you might phrase as, am I understanding you properly? As soon as that was the basic thing that my hands were saying, people were entering into this kind of wonderful, deep untangling process without my doing anything else. So there's the kind of secret in there.
Yes.
Somehow.
Yes.
There's something to learn from that.
Yes. Well, I found your essay to be a lesson in and of itself. Your writing was so much, it reminded me of my days when I was training, just so much about the whole embodiment of being with the student and not going straight to that, pain signal, or, what they're coming here because, their voice is hoarse, or, and you kind of, I feel like, took the readers back into that, what the Alexander technique, yes, this enigma of the Alexander technique, but the way that you used your examples, they were so clear and vivid to kind of really start thinking about things differently. And to first start with, let's look at this dynamic in our relationship with the student. Let's invite the student as opposed to teach the student or try to fix the student. And I think there was so much pause in that writing, where you kind of pause with where you think your mind is going, and you just pause and and take a step back and really think about what your words were saying. So I really, really enjoyed that part. And really a lot of the essence of your essay is really this notion of creative attention. Could you elaborate a little bit more on those two words, because they're unique when they're come together?
Sure. That ended up being the title of the essay, and
Yes.
it happened like titles of essays often do, kind of quite near the end, that I
Mm-hmm.
went, that's what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And writing the essay helped me find it. I think the idea is that neurological activity is often divided into outgoing signals and incoming signals, what neurologists would call efferent and afferent signals. So an outgoing signal might be my central nervous system sending a signal to a muscle saying contract. Or an incoming signal might be some nerve endings in my hand sending information into my central nervous system saying that water's hot. And usually they're sort of understood as the outgoing ones are causative, the incoming ones are sensory and informative. But I this particular example kind of was preying on my mind, which is that if a person, maybe a child who's not terribly confident of herself or something, really trusts an adult to pay attention to her properly, then it's not such a big leap to say, well, she's actually going to start sharing things with me that otherwise just wouldn't get said. So that situation is one where the attention, the sensory attention, is actually causing something out in the real world. It's a kind of invitation. So creative attention is exactly that. It's a kind of sensory focus that seems to invite things or even cause things to happen. And I think that's not how we normally do stuff. But actually a good example is what we were talking about just a minute ago, where I said, if I've got my hands on simply with that curiosity and kind of quiet uncertainty of just saying, do I understand you? That I started finding people's nervous systems were sort of explaining themselves to me in a rather unexpected and wonderful way.
Yes.
So that's what the creative attention is about.
You know, I loved it, especially the example you gave about, taking the head, forward and up. And it's not about trying to take the head forward and up before, as you mentioned, and that it goes back to what I was saying before about this reminding me so much of, the training for master teachers is so much about letting the body be and letting that communication between teacher and student happen, and the exchange that you talk about also between the nervous systems and that communication that's going on as well. Could you possibly give us a little bit more insight into what you also spoke about, which is this idea of learning to listen? So this is part of the creative attention, but also this process of learning to listen, which you mentioned in the essay.
I don't think there's any trick or secret to it. And I also don't think there's any shortcut. I guess the idea of not being an expert, not being going, I know, but actually really being interested and really recognizing that you don't know, just like the life drawing of going, I've got to look, I've got to really look, and when I've looked, I've got to look some more. The I guess that kind of beginner's mind, therefore, is, I would say, is the most important idea. And the other equally most important idea is one of focus. And I think that takes practice. That you can't do focusing by trying to focus.
Right. Don't stare at the elephant in the room. Don't stare at the elephant.
Yeah. But it does respond to practice.
Yes.
And I think if one does find, I mean, it can be anything. It doesn't have to be Alexander work. It could be life drawing. It could be a particular kind of demanding sport that demands focus. Otherwise, you start making mistakes.
Right.
And I think with practice, people do just get better at paying attention to what they're doing. And I guess the other thing is that there's a proverb, isn't there, that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak.
Yes.
And I think that's a good one. That one can. I mean, for me, when I find I'm not really paying attention, I just shut up, and then I start noticing more. But yeah, I think it's that genuine interest, really, in just saying, I know you've got something to tell me that I don't know, and I just really love to know that, and kind of renewing that genuine curiosity.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's what I sensed from your writing, is this sense of renewal and bringing yourself back, and through this lens. And it's I think no surprise that you're also a musician, because this sense of fine tuning that you do with the listening, that's what it seemed like to me, is sort of like fine tuning that listening even more. We're just gonna fine tune it some more, and whether it needs less or more focus, which also leads me to this next part that I really liked. You wrote, beyond the very crude notions of telling someone what to do or leading, and doing what you're told, following, lies the endlessly complex world of successful collaboration and creative human interaction, which I loved. And it's just such a brilliant, poetic piece of writing here. And I'm going to put the link in here so that people can read the full essay, because it's a great read. But what I loved about it after I read your piece was that this idea of the teacher and the student, this dynamic and this relationship informs one another. And I thought that that's really it. That's really that communication. That's really life. And I love that so much. And maybe you could share a bit more about that realization and how you came to that.
Sure. I don't dance tango, but I do Aikido, and I think in some ways they're similar. But I think maybe I'll talk about tango, even though I don't know so much about it. Really good leaders, and in both of those disciplines, you kind of have somebody who's leading, who in tango is conventionally the man, and you have somebody who is following. And really good leaders conspicuously really don't impose on their partners and kind of push them about. There's much more of a question of saying, how is this person moving? What invitations can I make that will make the whole experience for everybody the most satisfactory and productive, rather than I want my way. I'm just gonna, and that's what the leading becomes, is kind of, I tell you what to do. I mean, of course, that's terribly crude, but maybe it needs saying. So then if the leader is actually taking their cue from the follower and saying, well, you know, what is it that would be the best thing for me to lead you into? Then they're actually doing something that I call leading by following. And then you start to get this blur of, well, okay, one of us might be leading by following, the other one might be following by leading. And then you start following by leading by following. And of course, the whole process gets endless then. And that's when the joy of it arises. And that happens in Aikido, it happens in Tango. And to me, it happens in Alexander work too, that there's this real kind of dialogue. And I often use unconventional setups for teaching. I mean, I could tell you there's a story that I relate at the end of the essay, which I think could be a useful.
I love that. Yes.
Thank you. A useful example, which was that one of my students, who's an opera singer, we were working on an aria in one of her lessons, and we ended up sat back to back whilst she was singing, sort of on opposite ends of a piano stool, with really kind of close contact between our two backs. And she sang, and it was great. But my experience was really peculiar, which was that her breathing mechanisms or muscles or processes or whatever you want to call them kind of got hold of mine. And she was kind of breathing me. It was really peculiar. And I guess I could have escaped if I wanted to, but I kind of didn't want to. I wanted to see where it went. So that was kind of my half of the experience. But her half of the experience was that she felt far stronger while she was singing in that process. So we had a real kind of double benefit out of that. Yeah. And then I guess there's one more thing that arises in that as an Alexander teacher, I could be sitting there thinking, well, I'm an Alexander teacher, and what's more, I'm your Alexander teacher, and it's my job to know how to breathe. But I think ultimately, the sort of greatest success in this situation is not in being kind of right, but in being responsive. And that one can be much too busy kind of being right to be properly responsive to a situation. And then the real ability to kind of follow or respond, not like a sheep, but kind of really intelligently, responsively, becomes the kind of highest skill. And that's in a way what I'm after.
It's beautiful.
Both in myself and my students.
Yeah, well, what you described with that student is kind of like the gift and joy of teaching, to have those moments where there's this real, authentic, and almost, for lack of a better word, it almost seems spiritual, even though the technique does not talk about, we're not like a spiritual technique, but there is this sense of otherness, otherworldliness, when that interchangeability happens, where it's a profound experience to have that happen, and to both of you have for her sense of awareness to be that good, that she was also able to experience that and understand what was happening. So that's the joy of teaching. So thank you so much for sharing that and your essay. And it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here, Tim. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you would like to add? Any final thoughts?
I've really enjoyed being here. Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim.